This session in counseling research, quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods, has a lot of information. It has an overview of qualitative approaches and case study research. It includes grounded theory, and it also includes phenomenological design. Some of the learning objectives, and we've already talked a lot about quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, but we're going to be going over some of that again. And then we're going to be looking at case study research. Remember, we talked about single case study design. This is looking at case study research for more of a general qualitative area. And then we'll talk about grounded theory research and recognize ethical, multicultural, and social justice issues in conducted grounded theory research. And then finally, we'll talk about phenomenological research. And I know that's a big word, but it's really an interesting aspect of research. All right, case study research. This is really pure qualitative. And some of you are going to just love qualitative research. Because if you're a person that's very narrative and you like stories and not so much mathematical analysis, you're really going to like case study research. It's used to explore events, develop models, create treatments, and understand the behavior of individuals. The big question with case study research is how or why. You are not going to be manipulating anything. You're going to be observing the participant and their behavior. There are different types of case study context-oriented research. One is intrinsic focus on a unique case. Let me give you a good example. A college student with self-injurious behavior. You're looking at one individual with a very unique case. Then there's instrumental, emphasis on a specific issue rather than the case. A great example would be the study of the phenomenon of hope. Isn't that interesting? Wouldn't you love to look at that? And then collective. You're comparing multiple cases. You're still looking at the same focus, but you might be looking at two individuals, two different women that have had childhood sexual abuse. The issue is the same, but you're comparing multiple cases. Explanatory is you're looking in depth at an issue, a young woman with borderline personality disorder. Then you have descriptive, an issue kind of within an issue. You might want to look at someone with an eating disorder in a particular setting so that you're kind of looking at both issues there. And last would be explanatory. That might be the use of ACT therapy treating anxiety with a young man. So you see, I would love to do any of those. I would really love to find out the how and why of those particular type of cases. So when you're conducting case study research, what are the different steps? You're going to establish the research question and propositions because the research question is a little different. It's not as analytical looking. Remember, it's kind of the how and why that we talked about. And your propositions are more of your hypothesis, but what you believe you may find when you get into that. You want to identify the case or the cases that you're going to be using, very purposeful. Then you're going to prepare and collect the data Now, preparing and collecting the data with a qualitative study is immense because you're looking at documents, you're doing interviews, you're observing people. I did one qualitative study, and my professor in my PhD program, I had to do it in a summer. So it was only like 10 weeks. It was exhausting to try to get all that done by the end of the semester. And then evaluate and analyze the data we're talking about. How do you do that? With quantitative, you put it all in SPSS and you get these wonderful findings that tell you all about it. Well, you've got to evaluate and compare all that information you found. And then the fifth one is report the findings. Again, writing it up is different also because you're going to be storytelling. Establishing the research question and the propositions that we talked about. There are outcome questions. What changes in behavior are we going to see? There are theory-building questions where you're creating or validating a particular theory that you have. There are pragmatic questions, which are very practical, logical questions. And then there are experiential or narrative questions, which really looks at the whole experience of the person. And remember, propositions help identify what specifics you might study to answer your questions. You want to make sure your cases are accessible and appropriate. Again, very purposeful for what you're trying to find. If you're looking with individuals that have had childhood sexual abuse, you want to make sure that all the individuals you're looking at are appropriate for your case. Unique versus common cases. Of course we want unique. People want to hear about unique. If you're going to provide additional information to the research community, you want to make sure you find something unique. And then just single versus multiple cases. That is totally up to the researcher. If you want to look at more than one case of testing anxiety with young men in college, or if you want to look at one case, that is up to the researcher. There are questions to ask. Will the case provide data that will help to answer the research question? Are you going to have access to enough data? Is the case appropriate for the study? Will your case represent, we just talked about this, a unique or a common situation? Will you use a single case or multiple cases? Or will you use a holistic or a case that is more inclusive of other individuals? So those are questions that you might want to ask. If you're preparing and collecting data, number one, you want to maintain flexibility. Research is maintaining flexibility, but even more so when you're doing qualitative research. I told you all about my study, and I was actually doing a study to see if youth groups and the Baptist organization were actually producing effective faith building in students. I thought it was a great study, and I found out actually that it did, but I had to constantly remain flexible because I was doing a lot of interviews and talking to individuals, actually going to youth groups, seeing what they had on the walls, seeing what kind of music they were playing. And so it was really interesting to do that. Make sure investigators are trained and have the skills they need. If you're not doing all of the research, which personally, if I'm doing qualitative, I'm going to be doing most of the research. But if I have other people that are working with me, I have to make sure they know what I want them to look at. Remember, we talked about how important it was to have operational definitions. If they're helping you and you're asking them to look for a particular definition, you've got to make sure they understand what that definition actually involves. Gain formal approval if you're in a higher ed institution with the review board. Now, this says conduct a pilot study first and then collect and store the data. I would never conduct a pilot study first. What you put in to this to do a qualitative study, I wouldn't do a pilot study and then do it again. They are suggesting that you could do that, but that would be a tremendous amount of work. Now, how are you going to analyze this? Remember, in the very beginning, we talked about one of the skills of good researchers is that they had analytical skills. Well, you've got to even have more in this type of research because, again, the wonderful thing about quantitative is you don't have to analyze anything. It does it all for you. So with analytical techniques in qualitative, I'm going to have to take all this material I've got, and I'm going to have to find out what is it telling me. Remember, I talked about my study of youth groups. I found themes: faith, friendship, fellowship. Those were patterns I found over and over again. So then I began to move my data into those three themes. Explanation building, how and why. Those are what we're looking at. Why is a youth group needed, and what is it providing for the church? Time series analysis. Over time, what are you seeing, especially if you're doing a lot of observation? And then logical models, very practical issues that you're looking for. The last one is cross-case synthesis. What if you are looking at more than one person? Maybe if you are looking at 3 women who had childhood sexual abuse. What you want to do is look at each case separately, and then at the very end, you want to analyze cross-casing. What did they say? Was there themes? Were there things in those cross-casings that really tell us something? And then generalizability can be a problem. Because it's very subjective. You try not to bring in your own personality, but you are writing the story and you are telling what you're observing. So sometimes generalizability can be a problem with qualitative research. When you're reporting the findings, there is no use in doing research if you're not going to share it with the world. So you got to know your target audience. Are you sharing it with physicians? Are you sharing it with professors? What is your target audience? What is your format and structure? And personally, I like the very structured format that you usually use for doing a research when you're writing it up. Have others do a final review of the report, and I do think that's very important. Having colleagues looking at it because you are analyzing. See if they see the same things that you're seeing. Single case narrative, you are really describing that whole narrative, storytelling, and when it's single case or multiple case, you want to make sure that you are including those individuals either that single person or those multiple persons to make sure that they are looking at your study and they're saying, yes, that's really what I wanted to say. You can use a question and answer format when you're reporting the findings. Most people do not, but you could. And then you could use purely cross case. You could, from the very beginning, report the cases and talk about everything that you saw that crossed over with both cases. Okay, we talked about structure, and this is pretty redundant, but you can do linear analytic, which is just like you do in journal articles, where you have the very beginning, the introduction, the lit review, the methodology. You can do it linear like that. You could do it, as we've said, comparative. You can do it chronological. As you observed, you can it's almost like keeping a journal. And then theory building is building logic for creating a theory. So you almost have to build one aspect upon another because you're proving a theory. The next one is interesting. You could structure it in suspense. You could put the conclusions first, and then you could talk about how you came to those conclusions. And then the last one is unsequenced. And I am not an unstructured person. So I think that would be very difficult just to start writing however you wanted to write. I think it would be hard to get a journal to accept that. And it would be hard for individuals, your target audience, to understand. Remember that qualitative research requires an understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of the method, that you're going to have to dig deep. You're going to have to understand the awareness and the influence and the thoughts and the feelings of your case. You are an observer. You are a participant. Also, the context of the study is ever changing. You think you're doing these propositions. You think you know, and then you get in the middle of the study and go, wow, that was a suddenly. I had no idea we were going that direction. It lends itself to human interaction because, again, we are participating together. These case studies I told you about, I am participating with them to try to understand, what are your feelings? I mean, I could do a whole qualitative study on grief to try to understand why different people react to grief differently. And then being sensitive to cultural considerations. You're going to see that all the way through your counseling program. Sensitivity to cultural considerations. Cultures are different. They're great. It's wonderful. I love that people have their own culture. It's important to them. And so for us to understand from their perspective, we're going to have to understand their culture. Now, grounded theory is a qualitative research, but it emphasizes the generation of theory from data while conducting research. Let's go back to something as simple as dialectic behavior therapy. How are we going to, and that's a pretty new, modern theory in counseling, how is Callahan going to be able to prove it worked? She was going to have to generate grounded theory to prove, so she could take this out into the counseling field and say, I've studied it with adolescent suicidal individuals, it works. And this is why it works. I've studied it with borderline personality disorder. I've done all this, and you can see where you couldn't do quantitative. And so she could say, this is how this works. After the data's collected, then you use key points or coding. Really, coding was what I was talking about with themes that we talked about with my particular study. Theory is used deductively and inductively. It's just an important concept that you need to know anyway, and probably will see it on the National Counselor exam. Remember, deductive is from specific to general. So usually all research projects start with deductive thinking, because you're going from your specific population, your specific case, and you want to generalize that to a larger population. So remember, specific to general. Then inductively, that is from general to specific. So you're really kind of going backwards with inductive thinking. You're taking a very large theory, and then you're moving backwards to try to prove it. Reflexivity is so important in qualitative research because it's a characteristic of the researcher that we can be very sensitive to what's going on in the whole process.